When people talk about Mount Everest, they often speak about glory, the highest point on Earth, the ultimate achievement for climbers. Photographs from the summit show smiling faces, fluttering flags, and the endless curve of the horizon far below. But Everest tells another story as well. High above 8,000 meters lies a region climbers call the Death Zone. Alesque for Yuka, where I have kag in most huge dregs, and crystal we flow again. And well, and fractional, and it is the Bell Zone and place where the air contains only a fraction of the sea level. At that altitude, the human body begins to weaken with every passing hour. Judgment becomes harder. Movement slows. Even simple decisions carry enormous consequences. On Everest, success is never defined only by reaching the summit. The real challenge is surviving the entire journey. Over the years, the mountain has witnessed moments of courage, loyalty, ambition, and difficult choices made under extreme pressure. Some climbers pushed themselves to prove what was possible. Others were trying to keep a promise. And some simply followed a lifelong dream to stand on top of the world.
Tonight we explore several of those stories.
Not to judge the people involved, but to understand the lessons Everest continues to teach.
This is K2 Story.
Part 1. David Sharp. A Climb for Purity. In the spring of 2006, Mount Everest was entering a new era. Commercial expeditions had become increasingly common, bringing climbers from around the world to attempt the summit. Some arrived with large teams, extensive support, and years of preparation. Others came with smaller budgets and a more independent approach. Among them was David Sharp, a 34-year-old climber from the United Kingdom. Sharp was known among friends as quiet, thoughtful, and deeply committed to mountaineering. He wasn't seeking fame. In fact, he preferred the opposite: small teams, simple logistics, and climbs that relied primarily on personal endurance rather than heavy support. Before Everest, he had already climbed Cho Oyu, the sixth highest mountain in the world. That experience gave him confidence that he could handle the altitude and the long days required for Himalayan climbing. But Everest is different from any other mountain. At 448 meters, the summit sits inside the death zone, where the air contains roughly one-third of the oxygen found at sea level. Climbers moving through this environment are operating at the very edge of human capability. Each step requires effort. Each hour at that altitude increases the risk of exhaustion, confusion, and severe physical stress. Sharp chose to climb without supplemental oxygen, a style admired by purists but significantly more demanding. He also joined a low-cost expedition with minimal logistical support. For him, the climb represented something deeply personal, a test of self-reliance. In mid-May, during one of the short weather windows that allow summit attempts, Sharp began his final push toward the top of Everest. Like most climbers on the northeast ridge route from Tibet, he started the ascent late at night, moving slowly under the beam of a headlamp while temperatures dropped far below freezing. Hour after hour, he continued upward. By early morning, he had reached the summit. For many climbers, standing on top of Everest is the culmination of years of preparation and sacrifice. But experienced mountaineers often repeat a simple rule: the summit is only halfway. Most accidents on Everest occur during the descent. After reaching the top, climbers are already exhausted. Oxygen supplies are running low, weather can change rapidly, and the margin for error becomes extremely small. As Sharp began descending from the summit ridge, conditions grew more difficult. The cold intensified, and fatigue began to slow his progress. Eventually, he stopped at a sheltered section of rock along the route, a location that climbers had used for years as a brief resting point while moving through the upper slopes. Throughout the day, other climbers passed through the area while making their own summit attempts. The climbing season of 2006 had drawn large numbers of expeditions, and dozens of mountaineers were moving along the same narrow route. In high-altitude climbing, helping another climber can be extremely complicated. At nearly 8,500 meters, even standing still for long periods can rapidly drain strength and oxygen supplies. Moving or assisting someone who is severely exhausted often requires several people, spare oxygen, and coordination from teams below. These realities create one of the most difficult ethical dilemmas in mountaineering. What responsibility do climbers have to others when their own survival is uncertain? In the weeks after the 2006 season ended, Sharp's climb became one of the most widely discussed events in the history of Everest. Newspapers, climbers, and historians debated what had happened and what could realistically have been done at that altitude. Some critics argued that the growing commercialization of Everest had changed the culture of climbing. Others pointed out the harsh physical limits imposed by the death zone itself. Experienced guides emphasized that rescuing a climber above 8,000 meters is one of the most difficult tasks in the entire world of mountaineering. Regardless of the debate, Sharp's story forced the climbing community to confront uncomfortable questions. Everest had always been dangerous, but as more people attempted the mountain each year, the decisions climbers faced at extreme altitude were becoming more complicated than ever. And David Sharp's climb would become one of the moments that reshaped how the world talked about responsibility on the highest mountain on Earth. His story is not simply about risk. It is about the difficult choices that arise when ambition, environment, and human limits meet in the thin air of Everest. And for many climbers, it was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. Because in the years that followed, Everest would witness other stories, each revealing a different side of the same unforgiving mountain. One of the most striking involved a climber whose dream of standing on the summit had taken years to reach. But like so many Everest journeys, the real challenge would begin after the summit.
Part 2. Shria Shah-Klorfine. The Cost of a Dream.
In May of 2012, Everest was experiencing one of the busiest climbing seasons in its history. Hundreds of climbers had gathered in Nepal, waiting for a narrow window of stable weather that might allow them to attempt the summit. For many, the mountain represented the final goal of years of preparation. For Shria Shah-Klorfine, it represented something deeply personal. Shria was a 33-year-old Canadian woman whose life journey had already crossed continents. She was born in Nepal, raised in India, and later moved to Canada with her husband, where she built a career in business and sales. Friends described her as energetic, ambitious, and optimistic about the possibilities life could offer. At Everest, for her, symbolized perseverance and identity. Like many modern climbers, she joined a commercial expedition, a type of guided climb that provides logistics, Sherpa support, and fixed ropes along the route. These expeditions have made Everest more accessible to people who are not professional mountaineers. But they also introduce new challenges. One of the biggest is experience. While Shria had spent time trekking in the Himalayas, Everest is far more demanding than most trekking peaks. Climbers must adapt to extreme altitude, harsh weather, and technical terrain while managing fatigue over many weeks of climbing. Still, she remained determined. In mid-May, when favorable weather conditions appeared, teams across the mountain prepared for their summit attempts. Climbers left Camp 4, located on the South Col, at around 8,000 meters, late at night, beginning the long climb toward the summit ridge. But during the 2012 season, another problem emerged: crowding. Because so many expeditions were attempting the summit during the same weather window, climbers began forming long lines along narrow sections of the route. At technical bottlenecks such as the Hillary Step, progress slowed dramatically. In the death zone, delays can be dangerous. Historical percents. Emission with the use of a mountain, and there is a totally sound about the map vertigo from us. Get ready.
Every minute spent waiting means less oxygen, more fatigue, and greater exposure to freezing temperatures and high winds.
Despite the slow progress, Shria continued climbing through the night and into the early morning hours. Eventually, after a long and exhausting ascent, she reached the summit of Mount Everest. Standing on the highest point on Earth is a moment many climbers describe as surreal. The horizon stretches endlessly in every direction. The Himalayas rise like waves of stone beneath the sky. For Shria, it was the realization of a dream she had carried for years. But as experienced climbers often warn, the summit is only part of the journey. The descent is where many accidents occur. After hours of climbing and waiting in lines, Shria began the long return toward Camp 4. The delays on the route had already consumed precious time, and many climbers were growing increasingly tired. Descending Everest requires careful movement over steep snow slopes and exposed ridges. Even small mistakes can become serious problems when climbers are exhausted. Shria began to slow down. Her Sherpa guide stayed with her, encouraging steady movement as the team worked its way back down the mountain. Other climbers passed by on the narrow route, each group facing the same challenges of fatigue and diminishing oxygen supplies. In high-altitude environments, rescuing an exhausted climber is extremely difficult. Carrying or supporting someone at nearly 8,000 meters requires significant strength and coordination, often involving multiple people and additional oxygen supplies. Even then, progress can be slow. Despite the efforts of those around her, Shria was unable to continue descending at the pace needed to reach the safety of camp before conditions worsened. News of the event spread quickly after the climbing season ended. For many observers, Shria's story became part of a larger discussion about crowding on Everest. The 2012 season had shown how quickly bottlenecks could develop when large numbers of climbers attempt the summit on the same day.
Mountaineering experts began asking difficult questions.
Had the number of climbers on Everest grown too large? Were commercial expeditions encouraging people to attempt the mountain before they were fully prepared? Or was Everest simply revealing the same truth it always had? That the highest mountains on Earth allow very little room for mistakes. To those who knew Shria personally, however, the story was not about statistics or policy debates. It was about a woman who pursued a goal with determination and courage. Her climb became a reminder that Everest is not just a geographic landmark. It is a place where personal dreams meet the harsh realities of altitude, weather, and time. And her story was far from the only one. Years earlier, another climber had attempted an even more ambitious challenge, reaching the summit without supplemental oxygen, alongside the person she trusted most. What followed would become one of the most well-known and emotionally powerful stories in Everest history. A story about partnership, commitment, and the difficult decisions that emerge when the mountain begins to test human limits.
Montaineering, Francis, and Sergei Arsenyev, a partnership tested by the mountain.
Mount Everest has always attracted climbers who want to push the limits of what the human body can endure. Some attempt new routes, others climb during winter, and a small number pursue one of the most demanding challenges of all, reaching the summit without supplemental oxygen. In 1998, an American climber named Francis Arsenyev set out to do exactly that. Francis was 40 years old and lived in Colorado. She was not the typical image many people had of an Everest climber. She was a mother, thoughtful and determined, someone who had gradually built her climbing experience over many years. Those who knew her described her as calm and focused, someone who approached challenges with patience rather than bravado. At her side was her husband, Sergei Arsenyev, a highly respected Russian mountaineer. Survival photographs. To Lucy and some of your help, conceived escapes. It is an augmented crypt. and is an unforgettable with them so. That those who should look most, they might get aware the title given to climbers who had summited the 5 highest peaks of the former Soviet Union. He was technically skilled, physically strong, and deeply committed to the mountains. Together, Francis and Sergei shared a dream that had taken shape over years of climbing together. They wanted to reach the summit of Everest without bottled oxygen, relying only on their physical conditioning and acclimatization. Climbing without oxygen dramatically increases the difficulty of Everest. At nearly 8,850 meters, the air pressure is so low that each breath delivers only a fraction of the oxygen available at sea level. Most climbers use supplemental oxygen above 8,000 meters to maintain coordination and clarity of thought. Without it, progress becomes slower and far more demanding. Even experienced climbers must move carefully and conserve energy with every step. In May of 1998, the Arsentees joined an expedition climbing the South Col route, the same general path used by most climbers approaching Everest from Nepal. Their first summit attempt did not succeed. Equipment problems forced them to turn around before reaching the top. For many teams, that would have marked the end of the season. But Francis and Sergei decided to try again. On May 22, 1998, they launched another summit push. The climb was slow and exhausting, made even more difficult by the decision to climb without oxygen. Every step required careful pacing. The body struggles to function efficiently at such altitude, and fatigue builds quickly. Eventually, after hours of effort, Francis reached the summit. With that achievement, she became the first American woman known to reach the top of Everest without supplemental oxygen. But as every climber understands, the summit marks only the halfway point. The descent is often more dangerous than the climb itself. By the time Francis and Sergei began their descent, they were already running late in the day. Darkness began approaching, and fatigue had accumulated after many hours above 8,000 meters. Somewhere high on the mountain, the couple became separated. Sergei eventually made his way back toward camp, but when he arrived, he realized that Francis had not returned. Instead of resting, he made a difficult decision. He gathered supplies and oxygen and began climbing back up the mountain, determined to find his wife. Climbing back into the death zone after such an exhausting summit attempt is an enormous physical challenge. Most climbers at that point are struggling simply to descend safely. But Sergei pressed upward, hoping to reach her in time. Meanwhile, other climbers moving along the route encountered Francis. Several attempted to help, offering assistance and encouragement. But at such extreme altitude, even small rescue efforts become complex. Moving a person who can no longer descend individually requires multiple climbers, additional oxygen, and stable weather conditions. Those resources are rarely available in the death zone. Sergei continued searching through the night, climbing higher in difficult conditions. At some point during this effort, he lost his footing on the steep slopes and fell. His body was later found further down the mountain. Francis remained high on the route where climbers had last encountered her. Over the years that followed, her story became widely known throughout the mountaineering community. Climbers passing along the route often spoke about the emotional weight of the place where the couple's climb had ended. Their story sparked many conversations about risk, ambition, and responsibility on Everest. Some climbers questioned whether attempting Everest without oxygen added unnecessary danger. Others saw the Arsentees as dedicated mountaineers pursuing a difficult but respected goal. For many observers, the most powerful part of the story was Sergei's decision to climb back up in search of his partner. Years later, in 2007, a group of climbers organized an effort to move Francis from the main climbing route, following the wishes of her family. But the legacy of the Arsentees is not only about tragedy. Their story reminds climbers that Everest is not simply a test of physical endurance. It is also a test of relationships, judgment, and commitment. And sometimes the mountain places those qualities under extraordinary pressure. Yet even among the many difficult stories on Everest, few images have stayed with climbers as strongly as the story of a German mountaineer whose final moments created one of the most enduring legends of the mountain. A climber whose final decision was simply to sit down and rest. But on Everest, even a brief pause can change everything. Part 4. Rob Hall and Scott Fischer. When leadership meets the storm. By the mid-1990s, Mount Everest was entering a new era. For decades, only elite mountaineers attempted the summit. Expeditions were small, highly technical, and often supported by national climbing teams. But as equipment improved and guiding companies developed better logistics, Everest began attracting a wider group of climbers, people who had the resources and determination to attempt the world's highest mountain under professional guidance. Two of the most respected leaders of this new generation were Rob Hall of New Zealand and Scott Fischer of the United States. Both men were accomplished climbers, with deep experience in the Himalayas, yet their personalities could not have been more different. Rob Hall was known for discipline and careful planning. Through his company, Adventure Consultants, he had already guided multiple successful Everest expeditions. His reputation was built on strict safety procedures and a calm leadership style that earned the trust of his clients. Scott Fischer, founder of Mountain Madness, brought a very different energy to the mountain. Tall, charismatic, and enthusiastic, he encouraged climbers to push their limits while maintaining a strong sense of adventure. Many of his clients admired his optimism and physical strength at altitude. In the spring of 1996, both guides were leading separate expeditions on Everest. At first, the season appeared promising. Weather forecasts suggested a short window of stable conditions in early May, and multiple teams prepared for their summit attempts. But there was one problem. Too many climbers were aiming for the summit on the same day. On May 10th, teams from several expeditions left Camp 4 on the South Col, beginning the long overnight climb toward the summit. The route above them included narrow ridges and technical sections where climbers must move one at a time using fixed ropes. These bottlenecks created long delays. Climbers were the people would have been self-remission, and in other limit experience when I planetasirk. Climbers waited in lines high above 8,000 meters, standing in freezing winds while precious oxygen supplies slowly diminished. Hours passed. Fatigue grew. The carefully planned schedules that guides relied on began slipping away. Rob Hall had always enforced a strict rule for his clients, a turnaround time that required climbers to descend if they had not reached the summit by early afternoon. But on this day, one of his clients, Doug Hansen, a postal worker from Seattle, was close to reaching the top after having turned back during a previous expedition. Hall knew how much the summit meant to him. Against his usual policy, he allowed the climb to continue past the safe turnaround time. By the time they reached the summit ridge, the afternoon was already well underway. Meanwhile, Scott Fischer and his team were facing their own challenges. Fischer had appeared unusually tired during the climb, something that surprised those who knew him well. Despite his exhaustion, he continued upward and eventually reached the summit later that day. Then the situation changed dramatically. A powerful storm system moved across the upper slopes of Everest. High winds and blowing snow reduced visibility, making navigation extremely difficult. Temperatures dropped rapidly as climbers attempted to descend through the gathering darkness. Many teams became separated along the route. Some climbers struggled to locate the fixed ropes that marked the safest path down the mountain. Others ran low on oxygen after the long delays earlier in the day. Rob Hall remained high on the mountain with Doug Hansen, working to help him continue downward. Hall refused to abandon his client even as conditions worsened around them. Through radio contact with base camp, He continued updating the situation, calmly describing the challenges they faced. As the storm intensified, rescue attempts became increasingly difficult. Other guides and Sherpas made extraordinary efforts to locate and assist climbers scattered across the mountain. Scott Fischer, exhausted after the long summit day, was also struggling during the descent. His Sherpa partner stayed close beside him, doing everything possible to support him as the storm swept across the ridge. But at those altitudes, progress is painfully slow.
Every step demands energy the body may no longer have.
By the time the storm finally passed, several climbers from different expeditions had been unable to reach safety. The 1996 Everest disaster ultimately became one of the most widely discussed tragedies in mountaineering history. 8 climbers lost their lives during the storm, including both Rob Hall and Scott Fischer. In the years that followed, books, documentaries, and films examined the events of that day. Writers and climbers debated the decisions that had been made, whether turnaround times should have been enforced more strictly, whether crowding had contributed to the delays, and how guiding companies should manage risk on Everest. There were no simple answers. High-altitude mountaineering involves countless variables: weather, fatigue, human judgment, and the unpredictable nature of the mountain itself.
Met daarom like round. Like B-wiki and Jindit Salvi. Whoa! Maar Twitter schrijf we no, de Jackson my defectable.
But one thing was clear. The events of 1996 changed how the world viewed Everest. It was no longer seen only as the ultimate adventure. It had become a powerful reminder that even experienced guides and well-organized expeditions are vulnerable in the extreme environment of the world's highest peak. And as the years passed, Everest continued to attract climbers from every corner of the world, each carrying their own dreams, ambitions, and expectations. Some came with decades of climbing experience. Others arrived from very different backgrounds entirely, including one athlete who believed that endurance from the marathon world could prepare him for the highest mountain on Earth. His story would become another reminder that Everest demands more than strength alone. Continue when you're ready. What Everest teaches us. Across the decades, Mount Everest has witnessed thousands of climbers standing on its summit. Photographs capture moments of triumph. Flags held high, tired smiles the vast Himalayas stretching endlessly beneath the sky. But the deeper story of Everest is not written only at the summit. It is written along the long, difficult journey that leads there. From David Sharp, whose solitary climb sparked a global conversation about responsibility in the death zone, to Shria Shah-Klorfine, whose determination collided with the realities of crowding and exhaustion high on the mountain, to Francis and Sergei Arsenyev, whose partnership showed how ambition and devotion can intertwine in the harshest environments on Earth. Their stories are not simply about success or failure. They are about human decisions under extreme conditions. The thin air above 8,000 meters changes everything. The body weakens. Judgment becomes slower. Even the strongest climbers must balance ambition against survival. And sometimes, those decisions become the defining moments of a lifetime. The tragedy of 1996, when Rob Hall and Scott Fischer led separate expeditions into a storm that changed the history of Everest, remains one of the clearest examples. These were not inexperienced climbers. They were among the most respected guides of their generation. Yet the mountain reminded everyone watching that experience alone cannot control every outcome. Everest does not reward determination in the same way other challenges do. A marathon runner can push harder to finish the race. A mountaineer on Everest must sometimes do the opposite. They must know when to turn back. In recent years, the mountain has continued to evolve. More climbers arrive each season. Technology, weather forecasting, and equipment have improved dramatically. Satellite communication now allows climbers to remain connected with the world far below. But the fundamental reality has not changed. At nearly 8,850 meters, the human body is operating near its absolute limit. The environment is unforgiving. Weather shifts without warning. Small mistakes can become serious problems in minutes. And yet, people will continue to come. Because Everest represents something powerful in the human imagination. It is the ultimate test of endurance, patience, and humility. For many climbers, the mountain is not only about reaching the top, it is about discovering what they are capable of enduring along the way.
Mein Estrangel ist der selber sie another richtige Pampas.
But if Everest teaches anything, it is this. The summit is never the final goal. Everest has a way of stripping away illusion. Up high, titles lose meaning. Experience narrows. The body speaks louder than ambition, and the mind learns its limits the hard way. In the death zone, there are no perfect decisions. Only the best ones a human can make with failing strength and incomplete time. The question of whether to leave someone behind is not a test of character in the way we imagine at sea level. It is a collision between ethics and physiology, between who we want to be and what the mountain allows us to be. In the death zone, there are no perfect decisions. Only the best ones a human can make with failing strength and incomplete time. Everest avinding me protacubout of fuio. It is a collision between etherigount the name to exists. All that much without midonity the pollux and a ninth being. It's igual boneme, a boneme, or gobiting. En in the vorcity vreshndru do lemme love na. Everest can bid you free that the forbus fiti. Every climber who sets foot on the mountain must remember a simple truth passed down through generations of mountaineers. On Everest, reaching the summit is optional, coming back alive is not. If you found these stories meaningful, consider subscribing to K2 Stories, where we explore the real history, survival lessons, and untold moments from the world's highest mountains. Days today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.